The smoke choked the air, black and suffocating. Silas coughed, his lungs burning as he moved through the wreckage of what had been a Vesuvius settlement just hours before. The thick, humid jungle pressed in from all sides, but here in the clearing, everything was ash and flame. The wooden structures still smoldered, sending up columns of gray death into the canopy above. The ground beneath his boots was scorched black, and the stench of napalm hung heavy enough to taste. He was 40 years old, dressed in filthy camouflage that had long since lost any official designation, carrying a makeshift bow of bone and sinew across his back, and a machete carved from some massive creature's femur at his hip. His movements were silent, professional. The muscle memory of 2 decades of war overriding the part of his brain that screamed at him to run from this place. He scanned the perimeter with eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. Bodies lay everywhere. The Vesuvi were tall, over 2 meters most of them, their skin a deep indigo blue that reminded Silas of ocean depths he'd never see again. Their limbs were twisted at angles that made his stomach turn, not from squeamishness, but from the waste of it all. He knelt beside one of them, pressing 2 fingers against the throat where a pulse should be. The skin was hot, feverish even in death. Dead. They were all dead. He straightened, spitting to clear the taste of smoke from his mouth. This wasn't his fight. Hadn't been for 4 years. The humans in the Vesuvi could slaughter each other until this whole damn planet ran red and blue with mixed blood, and it wouldn't change a thing. He needed to move, to get back to his camp before the scavengers came, or worse, before either side sent patrols to finish the job. But then he heard it, a small sound, barely audible over the crackle of dying fires, a whimper. Silas froze. His hand went to the machete instinctively, but he didn't draw it. Instead, he turned slowly, following the sound to what remained of the largest structure. The central beam, massive and still glowing with internal heat, had collapsed inward, crushing everything beneath it. Smoke still rose from the charred wood in thick, choking waves. And there, beneath that beam, was a hand, small, 4-fingered, blue. He moved closer, crouching low. The smoke made his eyes water, but he could see her now. A child, no more than 4 years old by human standards. Though with the Vesuvi, it was hard to tell. She was pinned under the beam, her small body trapped from the waist down. Her eyes were fully black, no whites at all, like a shark's eyes, and they were wide with terror that transcended species. When she saw him, she hissed. The sound was pure animal, a warning and a plea all at once. Her tiny hands clawed at the burning wood, leaving streaks of blue blood on the charred surface. The fire was spreading toward her, licking at her bare feet with orange tongues. Silas stood there, every instinct telling him to walk away. This wasn't his problem. This was a Vesuvi child, the enemy, the same people whose warriors had killed dozens of his friends, who had set traps that had torn men apart in the jungle darkness. Saving her would accomplish nothing. She'd grow up to kill humans anyway if she survived long enough. He turned to go. His first step crunched on broken glass. His second took him 2 meters away. On his third step, she screamed. It wasn't a hiss this time. It was a child's scream, raw and helpless and terrified, and it hit something in Silas that he thought had died years ago. He stopped. He stood there for 5 full seconds. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. His fists balled at his sides. Then he cursed, a stream of profanity that would have made a sergeant proud, and he spun back around. He dropped his bow and quiver, knowing they'd just get in the way. His hands found a chunk of stone, jagged and heavy, near the collapsed wall. He wedged it under the beam, testing the leverage. Not enough, not nearly enough. The heat was intense. He could feel it through his clothes, baking his skin, making sweat pour down his face and sting his eyes. The little girl had stopped hissing. She was watching him now with those black, bottomless eyes, her small chest heaving with rapid breaths. Silas braced his shoulder against the beam. The wood was hot enough to burn, even through the thick fabric of his jacket. He felt the fibers begin to singe, smelled his own burning hair. He planted his feet, locked his knees, and pushed. Nothing. The beam didn't budge. He roared, a sound of pure rage and effort, and threw every gram of strength he had into the push. The muscles in his neck stood out like cables. His back muscles screamed in protest, threatening to tear from the bone. His vision went red at the edges from the strain. The beam shifted. Just a centimeter, then 2, then 5. Silas kept pushing, kept screaming, feeling something in his spine give way with a hot spike of agony. 10 centimeters, 15, 20. The gap was just barely wide enough. With his free hand, the one not braced against the hellish weight of the beam, he reached down and grabbed the child by what passed for a collar on her simple garment. He yanked hard, pulling her free with one violent motion that made her shriek in pain. The beam fell. Silas had already moved, stumbling backward, with the girl clutched against his chest. The beam hit the ground where she'd been trapped with a crash that sent up a mushroom cloud of sparks and ash. A piece of burning wood flew past Silas's head, close enough to singe what was left of his hair. He kept moving, pushing through the smoke, coughing so hard he thought he'd vomit. His arms were covered in blisters already, the skin bright red and weeping. The girl was limp in his arms, either unconscious or in shock. Her claws, small but sharp, dug into his neck instinctively as she clung to him. Silas burst from the burning structure into the relatively clear air outside. He fell to his knees, gasping, still holding the child. Blood ran down his neck from where her claws had punctured skin. His back felt like someone had driven a knife into it and twisted. His arms looked like they'd been dipped in boiling water. And then he heard the sound of weapons being readied. He looked up. 6 Vesuvi warriors stood in a semicircle around him, having emerged from the jungle as silently as death itself. They were huge, even bigger than the civilians he'd seen dead in the ruins. Their muscles were sharply defined under their blue skin, which in the firelight looked almost purple. They wore minimal armor, just leather and bone, but they were armed with spears tipped with black glass that could slice through flesh like air. The leader stepped forward. He was a nightmare made flesh, over 2.5 meters tall, with scars covering his torso like a roadmap of violence. One of his eyes was milky white, blind, the socket around it a mass of scar tissue. His teeth, when he bared them, were sharp and numerous. Silas didn't try to stand. He couldn't, not with his back screaming and his legs trembling from exhaustion. He just knelt there, breathing hard, keeping his body between the warriors and the child. The little girl, Valana, he would later learn was her name, was starting to come around. She made a small sound of pain and confusion, then looked up and saw the warriors. She tried to reach for them, but when the nearest one stepped forward, she panicked. Her grip on Silas's neck tightened until he could feel the blood flowing freely. She pressed her face against his chest and made a high-pitched keening sound that spoke of pure terror. The scarred leader stopped, his good eye fixed on Silas's arms, taking in the blistered, burned flesh. Then his gaze moved to the smoking ruin of the building behind them, to the fallen beam, to the small blue child clinging to a human as if he were her only anchor to life. Silas met that gaze and didn't look away. He was dead. He knew it. He'd known it the moment he'd decided to go back for the girl. These warriors would kill him, and there was nothing he could do about it. His weapons were back in the fire, and even if he'd had them, he was in no condition to fight, but he'd be damned if he'd die begging. The scarred leader raised his weapon, a sword made from the rib of something massive, filed to a razor edge. The firelight caught the bone and made it gleam like blood. He held it high, point down, ready to plunge it through Silas's chest. Then he stopped. The warrior looked at Silas's hands again, at the raw meat that his palms had become, at the way the human was shaking from pain and exhaustion, but still holding the child with impossible gentleness. The warrior looked at Valana, alive and breathing when she should have been ash. Slowly, so slowly that Silas thought he was imagining it, the scarred leader lowered his weapon. He drove the point into the earth at his feet instead of into Silas's heart. Then he made a sound, deep and guttural, that came from somewhere in his massive chest. The other 5 warriors immediately bowed their heads, exposing their throats in a gesture that Silas recognized even through his pain-fogged mind. It was submission. Absolute, total submission. The scarred leader spoke. The language was harsh, full of clicks and growls that human vocal cords couldn't reproduce. But Silas understood the meaning, if not the words. He'd watched these people long enough to know their gestures, their body language. You gave her fire birth. You burned your flesh to give her life. She is yours by right of sacrifice." The leader looked at Vilana, who was still clinging to Silas and whimpering. When the warriors tried to approach, she screamed and buried her face deeper into the human's chest. The leader nodded slowly, understanding. He gestured to his warriors. They melted back into the jungle without a sound, shadows returning to shadow. The leader remained for a moment longer, his one good eye fixed on Silas. Then he too was gone, leaving nothing but the rustle of leaves to mark his passing. Silas sat there in the firelight, holding a child who wasn't even his species, bleeding and burned, and more confused than he'd been in his entire life. Vilana's sobs were quieting now, though she still gripped him with desperate strength. He looked down at her, at the black eyes and blue skin and four-fingered hands, and wondered what the hell he'd just done. But there was no time for wondering. He was in the middle of a war zone, injured, and now carrying what both sides would see as a biological weapon or a traitor's trophy. He had to move, had to get somewhere safe, except there was nowhere safe. Not anymore. Silas forced himself to his feet, biting back a scream as his back protested. He adjusted his grip on Vilana, holding her against his chest with one arm, while his other hand fumbled for the machete at his belt. The weapon felt heavy, too heavy, but it was all he had. He started walking, each step a small agony, heading for the human perimeter. He'd give the child to the medics, let them figure out what to do with her. He'd done his part. He'd saved her life. That was enough. It had to be enough. The jungle was thick with the sounds of night. Things moved in the canopy overhead, their calls alien and unsettling. Twice Silas had to stop and hide as patrols passed nearby, pressing himself and Vilana into the shadows of massive trees with roots like walls. The child had gone quiet now, almost catatonic, her eyes wide and unblinking. After 2 hours of painful progress, Silas saw lights ahead, the human checkpoint, Delta Station, a fortified position at the edge of the occupied zone. He felt something like relief, though it was distant and muted. He was close. Just a few more meters. He stepped out of the jungle and into the cleared ground around the checkpoint. Immediately, spotlights blazed to life, blinding him. He stumbled, raising his free hand to shield his eyes. Vilana whimpered and pressed her face against his chest again. A voice boomed from a loudspeaker, harsh and mechanical. "Unknown contact. Drop your cargo and identify yourself." Silas tried to speak, but his throat was raw from smoke. He coughed, spat blood, tried again. "It's a child." His voice came out as a rasp, barely audible. "She needs medical attention." There was a pause. Then the voice came again, colder this time. "Hostile life form detected. Contamination protocol alpha. Prepare to engage." Silas's mind struggled to process what he was hearing. Then he understood. They saw Vilana's blue skin. They saw an alien, and they didn't care that she was 4 years old and terrified. The rules were clear. No contact, no exceptions. "Wait." He tried to move forward to show them it was just a child, but the response was immediate. A gunshot cracked the night. The bullet hit the ground half a meter in front of him, throwing up a spray of dirt. A stone fragment from the impact sliced open his cheek, adding new blood to the old. "Final warning, drop the hostile." Another shot. This one didn't miss by much. Silas felt the bullet pass close enough to his shoulder to burn, felt the impact as it grazed flesh and drew a line of fire across his deltoid. They were shooting to kill. Maybe not at him. Not directly, but they didn't care if he was in the way. In their eyes, he was compromised. A vector. A traitor. Silas made his decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He spun, hunching his body over Vilana, and ran back into the jungle. Behind him, an automatic weapon opened up, stitching bullets through the night. He heard them crack past his head, felt one tug at his jacket, heard them thunk into trees and whine off stones. He ran until his lungs screamed for air, until his legs gave out, and he collapsed in a drainage ditch half filled with stagnant water. Vilana was crying again, a quiet, hopeless sound that cut him deeper than any bullet could have. Silas lay there in the mud and realized with perfect, terrible clarity that he had nowhere to go. The humans would kill him as a traitor. The Vesuvi would kill him as a human. He was alone in a jungle that wanted him dead, carrying a child that would make him a target for everyone. He laughed. It was a broken sound, edged with hysteria, but he couldn't help it. 4 years of surviving on his own, of staying invisible, of avoiding both sides, all thrown away for a child he'd known for less than an hour. Vilena stirred in his arms. She looked up at him with those sharp black eyes, and her small hand touched his bleeding cheek with something like concern. In that moment, looking down at her, Silas made a promise. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. He'd keep her alive, no matter what it cost. 4 years passed like a fever dream of survival. Silas taught himself medicine from necessity, setting his own broken bones and suturing his own wounds with fiber stripped from local plants. He learned which fungi would fight infection and which would kill faster than any weapon. He became an expert in pain management without drugs, which meant learning to simply endure. Vilana watched and learned. She was perhaps the fastest learner he'd ever seen, picking up survival skills with an intensity that bordered on frightening. When Silas showed her how to walk through dry leaves without sound, she practiced until her feet bled blue. When he taught her to build shelter from branches and broad leaves, she worked until her small hands were covered in calluses. The jungle became their world. Silas found a cave system hidden behind a waterfall, high enough to avoid the floods that came with the rainy season. He built traps and snares, learned the migration patterns of the local fauna, mapped the territories of the most dangerous predators. He became a ghost, a rumor, something that might not even be real. And Vilana grew. By the time she was 8 years old, she was wild in a way that no human child could ever be. Her movements had a fluid, inhuman quality that made Silas's skin prickle sometimes when he watched her hunt. She could leap between tree branches that would have sent a human child plummeting to their death, her four-fingered hands gripping bark with a strength that belied her size. But her eyes, when she looked at him, were Silas's anchor to sanity. They held intelligence, understanding, even humor sometimes. She was learning to be human even as she remained utterly alien, and the contradiction of it fascinated and terrified him in equal measure. They were crouched in the undergrowth now, Silas and 8-year-old Vilana, watching a six-leg browse on low-hanging fruit. The creature was massive, easily the size of a rhinoceros, with a thick hide and 6 powerful legs that could crush a human skull like an egg. Its tusks were curved and sharp, stained with the sap of the trees it bulldozed through. Vilana looked at Silas. He nodded. She moved. She was up in the trees in seconds, leaping from branch to branch with impossible grace. The six-leg heard the movement and snorted, its small eyes tracking the source of the sound. Vilana deliberately shook a branch, making leaves fall like rain. The creature bellowed and charged at the tree. Vilana led it on, appearing in gaps in the canopy just often enough to keep the six-leg enraged and chasing. She was herding it, driving it toward the narrow ravine where Silas waited. The girl was fearless, dancing along branches that swayed under her weight, trusting her instincts and her training. The six-leg crashed through the undergrowth, following the flickering blue shadow above. It entered the ravine at full charge, its tusks lowered, ready to gore anything in its path. Silas dropped from the overhang above. His bone knife was in his hand, gripped so tight his knuckles were white. He landed on the creature's back, his knees slamming into its thick hide hard enough to make it stumble. The six-leg roared and bucked, trying to throw him off. Silas wrapped one arm around what passed for the thing's neck, feeling muscles like iron cables flexing beneath the skin. His other hand drove the knife down, aiming for the soft spot just behind the skull. The blade skittered off bone, drawing blood but not hitting anything vital. The six-leg reared, and Silas felt himself sliding. His hand found a ridge of scar tissue, some old wound, and he grabbed it desperately. The creature slammed itself sideways into the ravine wall, trying to crush him. Silas pulled his legs up just in time, feeling rocks scrape his boots. He repositioned the knife, measuring the angle with a hunter's instinct honed by years of necessity. This time when he struck, the blade went in true. The six-leg's roar became a gurgle. It took 3 staggering steps forward, then collapsed. Silas rolled off the dying animal, landing hard in the mud. His ribs ached from the impact against the wall, and he could already feel bruises forming. But they had meat. Enough meat to last them 2 weeks if they smoked it properly. Vijana appeared beside him, her landing as silent as a cat's. She looked at the dead sixth leg, then at Silas and made a clicking sound that he'd learned meant approval. Together they set about the grim work of butchering, using every part they could. Meat for eating, hide for clothing and shelter, bones for weapons and tools. Nothing was wasted. The jungle didn't allow for waste. That night, as they sat by their smokeless fire in the cave, Silas noticed Vijana watching him. She was tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick, but her eyes kept flicking to his face. "What?" he asked. His voice was rough from disuse. They didn't talk much. Talking drew attention. Vijana pointed to the marks she'd drawn. They were crude but clear. A large figure, humanoid but wrong. A smaller figure, clearly meant to be her. Between them she'd drawn a line. Family, he realized. She was asking about family. Silas looked away into the flames. He had no way to explain where he'd come from, the world that had sent him here to fight in a war that wasn't his. He had no way to tell her about the home he'd lost, the people who died, the civilization that might not even exist anymore for all he knew. Instead, he reached out and erased the line she'd drawn between the two figures. Vijana watched, her head tilted in that way she had when she was trying to understand. Silas put his hand on her shoulder, squeezed once, then went back to tending the fire. After a moment, Vijana leaned against his side. She was warm, warmer than a human, her metabolism running hot. Silas didn't push her away. Days turned into weeks, turned into months. The rains came and went. Silas's hair went from gray to white. His body was lean and hard, stripped down to essentials by the constant demands of survival. Scars covered his arms and torso like a patchwork map of near-death experiences. He moved like a predator now, had become something not quite human anymore. And he watched both armies with equal contempt from his hidden vantage points. The humans were pushing deeper into Vesuvi territory, using weapons that turned the jungle to ash. The Vesuvi fought back with tactics born of desperation, ambushes that left no survivors, traps that were as cruel as they were effective. Silas sabotaged both sides. When human soldiers laid mines along animal migration routes, he found ways to mark the trails, using symbols both sides would recognize as danger. When Vesuvi warriors prepared to poison water sources that fed into human bases, he diverted streams or collapsed banks to prevent the contamination. He wasn't trying to stop the war. That would have been as futile as trying to stop the rain. He was trying to protect the jungle itself, the ecosystem that kept him and Vijana alive. Every scorched earth tactic, every poisoned river, every deliberate destruction of habitat made his world smaller and more dangerous. The soldiers started telling stories about him. The humans called him the jungle demon, a ghost that stole ammunition and destroyed equipment. The Vesuvi whispered about the white spirit that broke spears and scattered hunting parties. Neither side knew the truth was a single, damaged man who just wanted to be left alone. One night, 3 months after the six-leg hunt, Silas was scouting a human patrol route when he spotted something that made his blood run cold. A squad of soldiers was setting up a new kind of mine, one he'd never seen before. These weren't anti-personnel devices. These were area denial weapons, designed to render entire swaths of jungle uninhabitable. He watched through his broken binoculars as they placed the mines along a narrow valley that dozens of species used as a corridor. When those mines went off, they'd kill everything for kilometers. The valley would become a dead zone. Silas waited until after midnight, until the rain started. The soldiers had posted guards, but they were sloppy, relying too much on their electronic sensors and not enough on their eyes and ears. Silas had learned years ago that electronics were useless in this jungle. Too much interference, too much moisture, too many things that shouldn't exist but did. He crawled through the mud on his belly, moving with agonizing slowness. His fingers found the juice of a plant that smelled like rot, squeezed it onto the rubber soles of the soldiers' boots where they'd left them outside their tents to dry. The juice would break down the rubber within hours, make it crack and peel. Next, he cut the straps on their packs with a blade so sharp they wouldn't notice until they tried to lift them. He found their ammunition stores and removed the firing pins from half the weapons, pocketing the small metal pieces. Not enough to make the weapons obviously useless, just unreliable. Finally, he picked up a stone and hurled it into the bushes 50 meters away. The response was immediate and predictable. Shouting, gunfire, chaos. The soldiers shot at shadows, wasting ammunition, terrifying themselves. Silas was already gone, melting back into the jungle with Villana waiting for him a kilometer away. When he reached her, she was sitting in a tree, and he could have sworn she was smiling. That silent, toothless smile that meant she found his antics amusing. "Humans are stupid," she said in the halting language they'd developed between them, part gesture, part broken words. "Very stupid," Silas agreed, "but dangerous when scared." They watched from a distance the next morning as the patrol tried to march out. Their boots fell apart. Their packs spilled contents. Their weapons jammed. Within an hour, they were forced to call for extraction, their mission a complete failure. Silas marked the mine locations on his mental map and made a note to deal with them later. For now, he and Villana had to move. He'd been too active lately, drawn too much attention. It was time to disappear for a while. But the jungle had other plans. The storm came fast, as they always did. One moment the sky was merely gray, the next it was black and roaring. Lightning turned the world white. Thunder cracked like artillery. Silas and Villana ran for their cave, but they were still a kilometer away when the real fury hit. Rain fell in sheets so thick it was like being underwater. Wind tore branches from trees and sent them flying like spears. Silas grabbed Villana's hand and pulled her toward a rock outcropping, anything to give them shelter. They almost made it. Then the Titan found them. It came from upwind, which was the only reason Silas didn't hear it until it was too late. The creature was massive, easily 3 meters tall at the shoulder, with a body like a bear's, but covered in chitinous plates instead of fur. Its head was a nightmare of bone and horn, and its paws were the size of dinner plates, tipped with claws that could rend stone. The Titan had been sleeping in the cave they were heading for. The storm had woken it, and it was not happy. It charged with a roar that shook the ground. Silas had time for one coherent thought. "This is how I die." Then he shoved Villana as hard as he could, sending her sprawling to the side, and he turned to face the monster with nothing but a bone machete in stupid, stubborn human pride. The impact was like being hit by a car. Silas felt ribs crack, felt the air explode from his lungs. He flew backward and hit a tree hard enough to see stars. The Titan was on him before he could recover, one massive paw pinning him against the trunk. Silas managed to get his makeshift shield up, a piece of 6-leg hide stretched over a wooden frame. The Titan's teeth clamped down on it, and Silas felt the wood begin to splinter. He could smell the thing's breath, hot and rank, could see the fury in its small red eyes. This was it. He was done. He looked past the Titan, saw Villana standing frozen in the rain, her black eyes wide with terror. He tried to shout at her to run, but he had no air for words. Then Villana moved, not away but forward. She grabbed Silas's spear, the heavy one he used for dangerous game, and she lifted it. Her arms shook with the weight, but she lifted it. She screamed, a sound of pure rage and fear that cut through even the storm's fury. She drove the spear forward with every gram of strength in her small body. The point caught the Titan in the soft flesh under its foreleg, slid between ribs and found something vital. The Titan roared and twisted, releasing Silas. It turned its attention to Villana, this small thing that had dared to hurt it. Saliva dripped from its jaws as it advanced on her, and Villana stood her ground with the spear braced against the earth, her face set in lines of determination that would have been comical on such a young face if the situation weren't so desperate. Silas found his feet. His vision was blurred with blood and rain, but he could see the Titan's exposed throat as it focused on Villana. He pulled his bone knife, the one he'd used to kill the 6-leg, and he lunged. The blade went in deep, severing the jugular in one sawing motion. Blood sprayed hot and thick. The Titan tried to turn, to bite, but Silas held on like a parasite, riding the thing down as it collapsed. It took a long time to die. They always did when the wound wasn't immediately fatal. Silas sat in the mud beside it, breathing hard, holding his ribs. Villana approached slowly, still gripping the spear. "You okay?" she asked in their shared language. Silas nodded, though it was a lie. His ribs were broken, at least 3 of them. and every breath was agony. "You saved me," he said. Villana looked at the dead Titan, then at Silas. "Family," she said simply, as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. They made camp in the Titan's cave once they dragged the body out. Silas needed to deal with his ribs, but he had no medical supplies beyond what the jungle provided. He instructed Villana to find a specific type of ant, small ones with powerful mandibles, the kind that built their nests in dead trees. She returned with a leaf full of them. Silas had fashioned a crude mirror from polished stone, and he used it to see the wounds on his side. 4 deep cuts from the Titan's claws, still bleeding freely. He placed the ants on the edges of the wounds, one at a time. They bit down reflexively, their mandibles clamping the flesh together like natural sutures. Once they'd bitten, Silas twisted their heads off, leaving the jaws in place. It was excruciating, but it worked. Villana watched the entire process without flinching, though her hands trembled slightly. When Silas was done, looking like something out of a nightmare with ant heads studding his wounds, she handed him water in a broad leaf. That night, as the storm finally passed and left the jungle steaming, they sat in comfortable silence. Silas knew this peace couldn't last. He'd been too visible, made too many enemies. Something would have to give. It gave the next morning when the hunter arrived. Silas felt it before he saw it. That prickle on the back of the neck that meant eyes were watching. The jungle had gone quiet in a specific way, the kind that meant apex predator. He signaled Villana to stay low and silent. Then he began to scan the tree line. The bullet hit the tree next to his head, sending bark fragments into his face. Silas threw himself flat, pulling Villana down with him. A second shot followed, precise and deadly. A third, each one closer than the last. Sniper. Professional. Military grade. Silas's mind raced. He was pinned down, injured, and outgunned. The only advantage he had was that he knew this jungle better than any human alive. He just had to survive long enough to use that knowledge. He looked at Villana, made a series of quick gestures. She nodded, understanding. They'd practiced this 100 times, a dozen different scenarios for when the inevitable came. Now it was real. Silas pulled a pouch from his belt, opened it to reveal thick gray mud from the stream bed. He smeared it over his face and exposed skin, then did the same to Villana. The mud was cold, cold enough to mask their heat signatures from thermal imaging. It wouldn't last long, but it might give them an edge. Another shot cracked the air. This one was aimed at the cave entrance, forcing them to stay inside. The hunter was smart, keeping them pinned while he repositioned. Silas knew the playbook. He'd written parts of it, back when he'd been on the other side. There was only one way out of this that didn't end with both of them dead. Silas had to turn the jungle itself into a weapon. He moved fast, grabbing his bow and the few arrows he had left. He led Villana out the back of the cave, through a narrow crack that opened onto a steep slope. They slid more than climbed down, the mud making it treacherous, but Silas didn't stop. Behind them, he could hear the hunter moving, the slight rustle of a lightweight exoskeleton pushing through undergrowth. The tech was good, but it wasn't quiet, not to ears that had learned to hear a predator's breath from 30 meters away. Silas led the chase toward the whistling bamboo grove, a section of jungle so dense that light barely penetrated. The bamboo was hollow, and when wind passed through it, the forest filled with an eerie, multi-tone whistling that could drive a person mad if they stayed too long. More importantly, the bamboo was home to something else, something Silas had discovered the hard way 6 months ago and had avoided ever since. He could hear the hunter getting closer, could hear the electronic whine of sensors trying to pick them up through the mud camouflage. Silas knocked an arrow, but he wasn't aiming at the hunter. He was aiming up. The hive was massive, hanging from an ancient tree at the edge of the bamboo grove. It was the size of a car, made of some papery substance that looked almost crystalline in the filtered sunlight. Inside it lived thousands of rolling insects, so named because they moved in coordinated waves that looked like a single, massive creature rolling through the air. They were also violently territorial and had stingers that could punch through leather. Silas let the arrow fly. It hit the hive dead center and stuck, quivering. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the hive began to vibrate. The hunter emerged from the bamboo, his rifle raised, his exoskeleton giving him enhanced strength and aim. He had Silas in his sights. Through the cracked visor, Silas could see the man's face, younger than him by at least a decade, with the hard eyes of a true believer. Then the hive exploded. Rollings poured out in a black, writhing mass that filled the air like smoke. They found the hunter immediately, drawn by the heat of his exoskeleton and the carbon dioxide of his breath. They covered him in seconds, a living carpet of stinging fury. The hunter screamed and fired wildly, his shots going wide. The Rollings didn't care about bullets. They cared about the threat to their home. The man staggered, blind and panicking, swatting at insects that kept coming in endless waves. Silas didn't wait to see how it ended. He grabbed Vilana and they ran, putting distance between themselves and the chaos. Behind them, they could hear the hunter's screams turn to wet, choking sounds. They found him an hour later, after the Rollings had returned to their damaged hive. The hunter was alive, barely. His exoskeleton was cracked and useless, the electronics fried by multiple stings. His face was swollen to the point of being unrecognizable. Silas stood over him, his bone knife in hand. It would be so easy. One cut, and this threat would be gone. The hunter looked up at him through swollen eyes, waiting for the killing blow. Silas drove the knife into the ground next to the man's head instead. He stripped the rifle and useless tech off the hunter's body, taking anything that might be useful. Then he pulled a piece of bark from his pouch and used a piece of charcoal to scratch a message. "Leave. The jungle will kill you faster than I ever could." He placed the bark on the hunter's chest and walked away. Vilana followed, looking back once at the broken man in the mud. "Why not kill?" she asked. Silas didn't answer. He didn't know the answer himself. Maybe it was mercy. Maybe it was just being tired of death. Whatever it was, he suspected he'd regret it. He was right. The hunter made it back to the human base, humiliated and furious. His report was damning. A human, gone native, living with the enemy, sabotaging operations. The decision was made within hours. Operation Scorched Earth. Silas first learned about it when Vilana woke him in the middle of the night, her hand over his mouth, her eyes wide with fear. He listened. In the distance, maybe 5 kilometers away, he could hear engines. Big ones, the kind that powered heavy machinery. They climbed to the highest point near their cave, a rocky outcrop that gave them a view of the valley below. What Silas saw made his blood run cold. The humans were bringing everything. Flamethrower tanks, mobile artillery, enough firepower to turn the entire jungle into ash. This wasn't a raid or a targeted strike. This was extermination. And on the other side of the valley, moving through the trees like a blue tide, came the Vesuvi. Every clan, every warrior, every able body they had. They'd felt the earth shake with the approaching machines and knew what it meant. This was their last stand, a suicidal charge to protect their sacred groves. It would be a slaughter. The Vesuvi would throw themselves at the tanks in waves, and the machines would cut them down like wheat. And when it was over, the humans would burn everything that remained. Vilana pulled on Silas's arm, pointing back toward the mountains. Her meaning was clear. Run. They could make it to the high country, above the tree line, where the machines couldn't follow. They could survive. Silas looked at the valley that had been his home for 4 years. He looked at the trees that had sheltered them, the streams that had given them water, the 1,000 small ecosystems that depended on this place remaining intact. He thought about the burned village where he'd found Vilana, about the countless times he'd hidden from both sides, watching them destroy everything beautiful in their quest to destroy each other. He was tired of hiding, tired of running, tired of watching while the world died by inches. "No," he said, "we don't run." He pulled out his battered map, the one he'd been maintaining for years, marking water sources and game trails and hidden routes through the jungle. His finger traced the lines until he found what he was looking for. 3 kilometers upstream, there was a natural dam. Massive creatures called beavers, though they looked nothing like earth beavers, had built it over decades. Behind it was a reservoir, millions of tons of water held back by nothing but interwoven branches and packed mud. If that dam broke, the water would rush down into the valley. It would hit like a hammer, sweeping away everything in its path. It would create a barrier between the two armies, prevent the battle, and give the jungle a chance to survive. It was insane. It was impossible. But it was all Silas had. He showed Valana the plan, sketching it in the dirt. Her eyes widened when she understood. She looked at the distant dam, then at Silas, and shook her head frantically. She was afraid of water. All Vesuvi were, their dense bones making them terrible swimmers. But she picked up her spear anyway. They moved fast, running parallel to both armies, taking routes that Silas had mapped months ago. They could hear the armies preparing to engage, could hear the electric whine of the tanks charging their weapons. Time was running out. The valley erupted into violence behind them. The humans fired first, streams of fire arcing through the dawn light like the breath of dragons. The Vesuvi screamed their war cries and charged, spears lowered, accepting death as the price of defending their home. Silas and Valana ran harder. Bullets started flying, not aimed at them specifically, but spraying the entire area in suppressive fire. Silas pulled the Titan hide shield from his back, the one he'd kept as a trophy, and used it to protect them from the worst of it. A grenade went off near them. The shock wave threw them both to the ground. Silas felt something hot slice into his leg, felt blood start to flow. He tried to stand, and his leg buckled. Valana was there immediately, her shoulder under his arm, taking his weight. She was stronger than any human child could be, but she was still small, and Silas was a grown man in heavy gear. They staggered forward together, a wounded man and a terrified child, toward a goal that seemed to get farther away with each step. The sounds of battle were deafening now, the screams of the dying mixed with the roar of flames and the thunder of explosions. The valley was becoming hell on earth, and Silas knew that if they didn't act soon, there would be nothing left to save. They reached the dam as dawn broke fully. The structure was enormous, a testament to generations of beaver work. It was easily 30 meters high and stretched across the entire canyon, a wall of wood and mud and compressed vegetation that held back an entire lake. Silas pulled his salvage axe from his belt, the one he'd taken from a dead soldier months ago. The weapon was heavy, meant for breaking doors, not trees, but it would have to do. He approached the dam's base, looking for the structural weak points. Then he heard voices, human voices. A squad of scouts had been positioned here to watch for flanking maneuvers. 4 of them, armed with rifles, and they'd spotted the blue-skinned child. They opened fire immediately. Valana moved like water, dodging behind cover, using her size and speed to her advantage. Silas didn't have that luxury. He was big and slow and injured, and the soldiers had the high ground. He did the only thing he could. He charged the dam, raising the axe, and started to chop. Each swing sent pain lancing through his wounded leg. Each impact drove the blade deeper into the wood, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. The structure was too massive, too well built. He needed hours he didn't have. A bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He hit the dam hard and slid down, leaving a smear of blood on the wood. Above him, the soldiers were repositioning, getting better angles. This was it. He'd failed. Then Valana was there, using her sling to fire stones with sniper precision. One soldier went down with a crushed eye socket. The others took cover, and in that moment of respite, Valana grabbed the axe. She shouldn't have been able to lift it. The weapon was as big as she was, but she planted her feet, raised it over her head with a scream of pure effort, and brought it down. And again, and again, and again. Her blows were wild, uncoordinated, but they had weight and desperation behind them. Cracks began to appear in the dam's face. Water started to seep through, at first just a trickle, then a stream. Silas forced himself up. The soldiers were advancing now, realizing what was happening. He had seconds, maybe. He grabbed the axe from Valana's hands, ignored the white-hot agony in his shoulder, and swung with everything he had left. The axe blade hit a key support beam. The wood cracked. Water pressure did the rest. The dam exploded outward. The sound was like the end of the world, a roar that shook the earth and rattled teeth. A wall of water 30 meters high rushed down the canyon, carrying trees and boulders and entire chunks of the dam with it. Silas grabbed Valana and they scrambled up the canyon wall, climbing hand over hand, finding purchase on roots and rocks. Behind them, they could hear the soldiers screaming as the water took them. Silas didn't look back. They made it to a ledge just as the water reached its peak, churning and frothing like a living thing. It swept past beneath them, close enough that spray soaked them to the skin. Viana was shaking, pressed against the rock face, her eyes squeezed shut. Down in the valley, the water hit. It struck the battlefield like a tsunami, a churning mass of liquid fury that swept away tanks and warriors alike. The carefully positioned armies were scattered like toys, their formations broken, their weapons useless. The water rushed between them, creating a river where none had been before. It was too wide to cross, too fast to ford. The battle ended not with a victor, but with a barrier. Silas watched it all from his perch, bleeding and exhausted. He saw the human commander standing on a hilltop across the new river, staring at the devastation. He saw the Vesuvi war leader, the same scarred warrior who'd spared Silas years ago, looking up at the mountains where the water had come from. Both leaders saw them, a human and a Vesuvi child, together on the cliff face, surrounded by the ruins of what they'd done. The Vesuvi leader raised his hand. It wasn't a gesture of attack or threat. It was acknowledgement, recognition. He turned his warriors around and began the march back to their territories, leaving the valley to the new river. The human commander watched them go. Then he looked at his troops, at the tanks half submerged in mud, at the men being pulled from the water. He gave orders and the humans began to withdraw as well. There would be no victory here today. Silas stood on the ledge. Vilana pressed against his side. His shoulder was bleeding freely, and his leg was a mass of pain that made him dizzy. But they were alive. Against all odds, they were alive. Vilana tugged on his jacket, pointing toward the mountains. Higher ground. Safety. Silas nodded. They started to climb, moving slowly, helping each other over rough spots. Below them, the new river carved its way through the jungle, bringing water and life to areas that had been dry. Birds were already gathering, and through the mist, Silas could see fish jumping in the current. The jungle, as always, adapted. They walked for hours, neither of them speaking. There was nothing to say. They'd stopped a war, or at least delayed it, and carved a scar across the landscape that would last for generations. Whether that made them heroes or villains, Silas didn't know. All he knew was that they were together, family. The word Vilana had drawn in the dirt all those years ago, the concept she'd understood before Silas had. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, they reached the gray zone, the high country where neither army ventured. It was cold here, colder than the jungle below, and the trees were different, their bark pale and their leaves like silver. Silas found a sheltered spot beneath an outcrop. They had no fire, no food, no medical supplies. They had nothing but each other and the clothes on their backs. But they'd had less before. They'd survived with less before. Vilana curled up against his side, shivering in the cold. Silas wrapped his jacket around her, ignoring his own discomfort. She looked up at him with those black shark eyes that no longer frightened him. "What now?" she asked. Silas looked out over the valley, at the silver ribbon of the new river winding through the green. He thought about the homes they'd lost, the families they'd left behind, the lives they could have had. He thought about the war that would continue, somewhere else if not here, until one side or the other was destroyed. "Now we survive," he said, "like we always do." Viana nodded, satisfied with that answer. She closed her eyes, trusting him to keep watch, trusting him to keep her safe. Silas listened to her breathing slow and even out as she fell asleep. He stayed awake, watching the stars come out one by one. They were alien stars, constellations he'd never learned the names of, in a sky that wasn't his home. But they were beautiful in their own way, and in the darkness, that was enough. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain from the east. Silas adjusted his position, trying to find a way to sit that didn't aggravate his wounds. He failed, but the pain kept him alert, kept him from letting his guard down. Somewhere in the valley below, both armies were licking their wounds and planning their next moves. The war wasn't over, it would never be over, not really. But for tonight, in this moment, Silas and Vilana were safe. He looked down at the child sleeping against his side, this alien girl who'd become his entire world. He'd pulled her from fire 4 years ago, and in doing so, had pulled himself from a different kind of flame. They'd saved each other, he realized. Not just once, but every day since. The future was uncertain. It always had been. But Silas had learned to stop worrying about tomorrow and focus on surviving today. Today they were alive. Today they had shelter in each other. Today was enough. As the last light faded from the sky and true darkness fell, Silas finally allowed himself to rest. Not sleep, never sleep, but rest. His eyes remained open, scanning the shadows, ready for whatever came next. Because something would come next. It always did. But when it did, he wouldn't face it alone. And in a jungle that had tried to kill them both in 1,000 different ways, that simple fact was worth more than all the weapons and armies in the world. The gray zone proved to be a different kind of hell. The cold was relentless, seeping into bones and joints, making every movement painful. Silas's wounds refused to heal properly in the thin air and freezing temperatures. The shoulder where the bullet had hit him festered despite his best efforts, turning the flesh around it an angry red that spoke of infection. Villana suffered worse. Her species wasn't built for cold. Her metabolism, designed for the humid jungle heat, struggled to maintain her body temperature. She shivered constantly, even when Silas wrapped her in every scrap of fabric they had. Her blue skin took on a grayish tinge that terrified him. They needed to descend. But going back to the valley was suicide. Both armies would be looking for them now. The humans for revenge. The Vesuvi for reasons Silas couldn't predict. They needed a different route, a different valley, somewhere neither side had claimed yet. On the third day in the gray zone, Silas woke to find Villana burning with fever. Her skin was hot enough to hurt his hand when he touched her forehead. She mumbled in her native tongue, words Silas had never heard her speak, thrashing weakly against the blankets. He had no medicine, no antibiotics, no fever reducers, nothing but cold water and hope. He spent the day forcing water down her throat, keeping her covered, pressing cold stones against her pulse points to try to bring the fever down. It wasn't enough. By nightfall, Villana was barely conscious. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her heartbeat irregular. Silas sat beside her, his hand on her chest, feeling each weak beat and wondering if it would be the last. He made a decision then. A stupid decision, a desperate decision, but the only one he had. There was a plant that grew at the edge of the tree line, something he'd seen the local mountain creatures eating. It had broad leaves with a silvery coating, and the animals sought it out when they were injured. The problem was that the plant grew in exposed areas, on cliff faces where the wind howled and the stone was slick with ice. One wrong step and he'd fall to his death. But if he didn't try, Villana would die anyway. Silas left her wrapped in everything warm they had, banking the small fire he'd managed to coax to life. Then he went hunting in the dark, using nothing but starlight to guide him. The climb was a nightmare. His wounded shoulder screamed with every reach, every pull. His leg, still bearing the shrapnel from the grenade, threatened to give out with each step. The wind tried to tear him from the rock face, and the cold made his fingers numb and clumsy. He found the plant growing in a crevice 50 meters up a sheer cliff. The leaves glowed faintly in the starlight, that silvery coating reflecting what little light there was. Silas reached for it, his fingers closing around the stem. The rock gave way. Silas fell, his stomach lurching into his throat. His hands shot out, grabbing blindly, and caught a root. The jolt nearly tore his arm from its socket, but he held on. He dangled there for a moment, breathing hard, before he managed to swing himself back to solid ground. He had the plant clutched in his other hand, crushed but intact. He didn't waste time celebrating. He descended as fast as he dared, sliding more than climbing, shredding the skin on his palms. Back at their shelter, Villana hadn't moved. Silas crushed the leaves between stones, creating a paste that smelled sharp and medicinal. He forced it between her lips, made her swallow, then applied the rest to her chest and throat. Then he waited. The fever broke near dawn. Villana's eyes opened, still unfocused but aware. She looked at Silas and made a small sound, her hand reaching for his. He took it, feeling the tremor in her fingers, the weakness. "You're okay," he said, his voice rough. "You're going to be okay." It took 3 more days before she was strong enough to travel. In that time, Silas scouted their route, finding a path down the far side of the mountain range into a valley he'd never seen before. It was smaller than the one they left, more isolated, with no signs of human or Vesuvi occupation. They descended slowly, Silas carrying most of their meager supplies, Vilana leaning on a walking stick he'd carved for her. The journey took 2 days, and by the end of it, they were both exhausted. But the new valley was warmer. Vilana's color began to return, and Silas could feel the tension leaving his shoulders. They found another cave, this one smaller but defensible, and they began the process of making it home. A month passed, then two. They fell back into their old rhythms, hunting and gathering, building their small world. Silas's wounds healed, leaving new scars to add to his collection. Vilana grew stronger, her movements regaining their fluid grace. But they weren't alone in this valley. Silas first noticed the signs 3 months after they'd arrived. Trees marked with claw marks too high for any animal he'd seen. Rocks arranged in patterns that spoke of intelligence. And once, when he was checking his traps, he found one already sprung and empty, the bait taken but no tracks left behind. Something was hunting in their valley, something smart enough to avoid being seen, skilled enough to move without a trace. Silas increased their security. He built better traps around their camp, set up warning systems using rocks balanced on tripwires. He taught Vilana to sleep light, to wake at the slightest sound. They were never more than arm's reach from their weapons. The attack came on a night when the moon was dark and the clouds hid the stars. Silas woke to the sound of stone grinding on stone, one of his warnings being triggered. He was on his feet instantly, bone knife in hand, shaking Vilana awake. They came from 3 directions at once. Not Vesuvi, not human, but something else entirely. They moved on 4 legs but could rear up on 2, their bodies covered in thick, blue-black fur. Their heads were wrong, too large and flat, with mouths that opened sideways to reveal rows of grinding teeth. There were 5 of them. They moved with pack intelligence, coordinating their attack to cut off escape routes. Silas pushed Vilana behind him and braced for impact. The first creature lunged. Silas sidestepped and drove his knife into its throat, feeling hot blood spray across his arm. The thing made a sound like rocks grinding together and collapsed. The second came from his blind side. It caught him across the ribs with claws like iron hooks, tearing through his shirt and into flesh. Silas grunted and spun, using his momentum to drive an elbow into the creature's flat skull. Bone cracked, and it staggered back. Behind him, Vilana was holding her own. She'd grabbed her spear and was using it to keep 2 of the creatures at bay, jabbing at their eyes and mouths whenever they got too close. She was fast, faster than them, but she was tiring. The 5th creature, larger than the others, circled around. It was waiting for an opening, watching with eyes that gleamed with cold intelligence. This was the leader, Silas realized. Kill it, and the others might break. He feinted toward the injured creature, then spun and threw his knife at the leader. The blade tumbled through the air and buried itself in the thing's shoulder. Not a killing blow, but enough to make it roar in pain and charge. Silas had been counting on that. He dropped flat as the creature lunged over him, and he grabbed its trailing hind leg. Using its own momentum, he yanked hard and sideways. The creature crashed into one of its packmates, and both went down in a tangle of limbs. Silas rolled, grabbed a burning branch from their fire, and swung it like a club. The flames struck the leader across the face, and fur ignited with a stench that made Silas gag. The creature screamed and fled, and the others followed, leaving their dead behind. Silas stood there, breathing hard, holding the burning branch high. Blood ran down his side from the claw marks, and his ribs felt like they were on fire. Vilana came to stand beside him, her spear still raised, her eyes scanning the darkness for more threats. They waited until dawn before they moved. The dead creature was massive up close, easily 300 kilos of muscle and fury. Silas wanted to leave it, but they needed to understand what they were dealing with. He and Vilana spent the morning performing a crude autopsy. What they found made Silas's skin crawl. The thing's stomach was full of partially digested meat, and among the remains were pieces of worked metal, bullets, belt buckles, dog tags. These things had been eating humans. Silas looked at the claw marks he'd seen on the trees, the height of them, and understood. There was a human patrol somewhere in this valley, or there had been. And these creatures had hunted them down and killed them. They needed to move again. This valley wasn't safe, would never be safe as long as these things were here. But Silas was tired of running, tired of always being one step ahead of death, of never having a place to call home. So he made a different choice. He was going to hunt the pack down and kill them, every last one. It took him 3 days to track the creatures to their den, a series of caves on the far side of the valley. Vilana wanted to come, but Silas refused. This was too dangerous, too uncertain. If he didn't come back, she needed to be alive to survive on her own. They argued about it, the first real argument they'd had in years. Vilana's grasp of language had grown, and she used it now to tell him exactly how stupid his plan was. But Silas was stubborn, and in the end she knew she couldn't change his mind. He left at dawn, carrying his bow, his knife, and a dozen arrows he'd spent the night making. He also carried fire, a torch made of resinous wood that would burn for hours. The den was worse than he'd imagined. The entrance was littered with bones, some human, some Vesuvi, some from animals he couldn't identify. The stench of rot was overwhelming. Silas tied a cloth over his nose and mouth and entered. The tunnels were tight and winding, forcing him to crouch and sometimes crawl. His torch threw dancing shadows on the walls, and every shadow looked like a threat. He could hear movement ahead, the scrape of claws on stone, the sound of something large breathing. He found them in a central chamber, 6 creatures, including the wounded leader. They were sleeping, curled around each other in a pile of fur and muscle. In the corner, Silas could see the remains of their latest kill, a Vesuvi warrior whose blue skin was barely recognizable. Silas didn't give them a chance to wake. He knocked an arrow, aimed at the leader, and let fly. The arrow punched through the creature's eye and into its brain. It died without a sound. The others woke instantly. They saw Silas, saw their dead leader, and charged with fury that shook the cave walls. Silas ran. He'd planned for this, counted on their rage making them stupid. He led them through the twisting tunnels, shooting arrows behind him whenever he had a clear shot. One creature fell with an arrow through its throat. Another stumbled with a shaft through its leg. He burst from the cave into daylight and kept running. Behind him, the 4 remaining creatures were right on his heels, their claws tearing up the earth. Silas led them toward the cliff edge he'd scouted earlier, a sheer drop into a ravine filled with jagged rocks. At the last second, he dove to the side. The creatures, blind with rage and momentum, couldn't stop. 3 of them went over the edge, their screams echoing as they fell. The 4th, smaller and smarter, managed to halt. It turned on Silas, lips pulled back from those grinding teeth. They faced each other across 10 meters of open ground. Silas had no arrows left. His bow was cracked from the run. All he had was his knife and his exhaustion. The creature circled him, looking for an opening. It came from his wounded side, going for the injury it could smell. Silas spun with it, using a technique he'd learned decades ago in a different life, and drove his knife up under its jaw. The blade punched through soft tissue and into the brain. The creature collapsed. Silas collapsed with it, too tired to stand. He lay there for a long time, listening to his heartbeat slowly return to normal, feeling the sun on his face. When he finally made it back to camp, Vilana ran to him. She checked him over for new wounds, her hands gentle but thorough. Then she hit him, hard enough to make him stumble. "Stupid," she said in their shared language. "Stupid, stupid human." Silas laughed. It hurt his ribs, but he laughed anyway. "Yeah," he agreed. "Really stupid." That night, they sat by the fire and Silas told her about the den, about the fight, about everything. Vilana listened without interrupting, her face serious. When he finished, she moved closer and leaned against him. "We stay here?" she asked. Silas looked around their small camp, at the valley spread out below them, at the sky full of alien stars. "Yeah," he said. "We stay." They had 2 years of relative peace after that, 2 years where the valley remained quiet, where they could hunt and gather without constantly looking over their shoulders. Vilana grew during that time, not just physically, but in every way that mattered. By the time she was 10 years old, she was nearly as tall as Silas and far stronger. She was also curious about things Silas couldn't answer, about her people, about where she came from, about the family she couldn't remember. Silas told her what little he knew, but it was never enough. Then one day, Vesuvius scouts appeared in their valley. Silas spotted them from a distance, 6 warriors moving in formation, clearly searching for something. He and Villana hid, watching them pass. But Villana's face was pressed to the gap in the rocks, her eyes fixed on the blue-skinned figures with an intensity that worried Silas. That night she asked him the question he'd been dreading. "Can I talk to them?" "No," Silas said immediately. "Too dangerous. They're my people. They don't know you. They might see you as contaminated, living with a human." Silas had seen enough of both species to know how they treated perceived traitors. Villana went quiet, but Silas could see the wheels turning in her head. He knew that look. She was planning something, and nothing he said would change her mind. She left 3 days later, while Silas was checking traps at the far end of the valley. She left a note drawn in pictures on a piece of bark, a stick figure with 4 fingers, walking toward other stick figures, a heart drawn next to the human figure that represented Silas. She would come back. The message was clear, but first she needed to know. Silas stood there holding the bark, feeling a cold fear settle into his stomach. He should go after her, should track her down and drag her back. But he knew that would destroy something between them, break the trust they'd built. So he waited. 3 days, 4, a week. His hands shook whenever he tried to do anything, and he couldn't eat. Every sound made him jump, hoping it was her returning. On the 8th day, she came back, but she wasn't alone. Silas saw them coming from his vantage point, Villana and 2 other Vesuvi, both young, maybe her age. They were talking, gesturing to each other with the easy comfort of friends. Silas felt something twist in his chest, seeing her so natural with her own kind. He climbed down to meet them. The 2 Vesuvi stopped when they saw him, their hands going to their weapons. But Villana stepped between them, speaking rapidly in her language. Whatever she said made them lower their spears, though they still watched Silas with wary eyes. One of them was female, taller than Villana, with intricate scars on her arms. The other was male, broader, with 1 broken tusk. Villana introduced them with a combination of words and gestures. The female was Susan, the male was Willie. They stayed for 3 days, those 3 young Vesuvi, camping at the edge of Silas's territory. He watched from a distance as they taught Villana things he couldn't, cultural practices and fighting techniques unique to her people. He watched her laugh with them, really laugh, in a way she never had with him, and he realized slowly and painfully that she was growing up, that she needed more than he could give her, that keeping her isolated was selfish, even if it was safer. When Susan and Willie left, Villana went with them. Not permanently, she made that clear. Just for a visit, to see the village they came from, to meet others like her. She promised to return in 2 weeks. Silas let her go. What else could he do? The 2 weeks were the longest of his life. He threw himself into work, building better defenses, stockpiling food, anything to keep his mind occupied. But every night, he sat by the fire and wondered if she'd really come back. She did, but when she returned, she was different. There was a new confidence in her movements, a sureness that came from knowing her place in the world. She told him about the village, about the families who'd welcomed her, about the stories they'd shared. "They remember," she said quietly, "the fire, the village that burned. They remember a child who disappeared. Do they know it was me who took you? They know you saved me." Villana looked at him with those black eyes. The elder, the one with the scarred face. He was there. He said, "You gave me fire birth, that you earned the right." Silas nodded slowly. He'd almost forgotten about that scarred warrior, about the moment of recognition in the burning village. "They want to meet you," Villana said. "Properly, as my..." They have a word. It means chosen father. Silas felt his throat tighten. "That's not a good idea." "Why not?" "Because I'm human. Because there's still a war. Because..." He stopped, struggling to find the words. "Because I'm not really your father, Villana. I'm just the person who happened to pull you out of a fire." She moved closer, putting her hand on his arm. "You taught me to hunt, to survive, to be strong. You protected me when your own people tried to kill you. You are my father in every way that matters." Silas looked away, blinking hard. "I don't speak your language. I don't know your customs. I'd be a stranger there. You're already a stranger everywhere, Viana said with brutal honesty. At least with us, you'd be a respected stranger. It took Silas 3 days to agree. 3 days of arguing with himself, weighing the risks, imagining all the ways it could go wrong. But in the end, he knew he had to try, for Vilana's sake, if not his own. They made the journey together, traveling through valleys Silas had never seen. Vilana knew the way now, having made the trip twice before. They moved carefully, avoiding areas where human patrols might be active. The Vesuvi village was built into the trees themselves, structures of wood and woven vines that seemed to grow organically from the massive trunks. Silas counted at least 50 buildings, which meant a population of several hundred. It was the largest concentration of Vesuvi he'd ever seen. Vilana led him to the center of the village, where a platform had been built around the largest tree. The scarred warrior was there, older now, his white eye somehow seeing more than the good one. He was surrounded by other elders, their blue skin marked with the scars and tattoos of long lives. They spoke in their language, words Silas couldn't follow, but he understood the gestures, the way they looked at him. Curiosity, respect, some fear. One elder, a female with silver threaded through her hair, approached him. She reached out slowly, giving him time to refuse, and touched the burn scars on his arms. She spoke. Vilana translated. She says your scars tell a story of sacrifice. She asks if you would share that story. So Silas told them. Through Vilana's translation, he described the burning village, the trapped child, the decision to go back. He showed them his arms, the places where the skin had melted and reformed. He described the years of running, of hiding, of protecting Vilana from both sides of the war. When he finished, there was silence. Then the scarred warrior stood. He spoke, his voice carrying across the platform, and Vilana's translation came with tears in her eyes. He says you honored the Vesuvi code without knowing it existed, that you valued life over loyalty, child over country, future over past. He says you are kin by choice, which is stronger than kin by blood. The warrior approached Silas. In his hands was a spear, beautifully crafted, its shaft carved with symbols Silas didn't recognize. The warrior offered it, and Silas understood this was a gift of enormous significance. He took it with both hands, bowing his head in respect. The gathered Vesuvi made a sound, a harmonious hum that seemed to come from deep in their chests. Acceptance. Welcome. Silas stayed in the village for a week. It was strange being among so many people after years of isolation. The Vesuvi were curious about him, especially the young ones who'd never seen a human up close. They touched his hair, fascinated by its texture. They marveled at his 5 fingers, so different from their 4. And Silas learned. He learned their language slowly and painfully, his human vocal cords struggling with the clicks and growls. He learned their customs, their history, their view of the war. He learned that they saw humans as invaders, yes, but also as worthy opponents. There was respect there, grudging but real. On the last day, the silver-haired elder approached him again. She spoke slowly, and Silas was surprised to find he could understand some of it without Vilana's translation. You have given us hope, she said. Hope that this war might end someday with understanding instead of extinction. Guard that hope. Guard our daughter. Always, Silas promised. They left the village with full packs and lighter hearts. Vilana was almost bouncing as they walked, talking excitedly about everything she'd learned. Silas listened and watched her, seeing the girl she was becoming, and felt a fierce pride mixed with an aching sadness. She was growing up. Soon she wouldn't need him anymore. But for now they walked together through the jungle, heading back to their valley. And for now that was enough. They were 3 days from home when they encountered the human patrol. It was pure bad luck. Silas and Vilana had been traveling through what should have been empty territory, following a ridgeline that offered good views and few obstacles. They'd let their guard down, just a little, talking instead of moving in silence. The patrol consisted of 4 soldiers, young and nervous, clearly new to the jungle. They were bunched too close together, making too much noise, their weapons held at the wrong angles. In other words, they were perfect targets for anyone who knew what they were doing. But Silas didn't want to fight them. He just wanted to slip past unseen. He signaled Villana to get down, and they began to circle around the patrol's position. Then one of the soldiers saw them. A flash of blue skin through the trees, unmistakable. The soldier shouted and raised his weapon. Silas reacted on instinct. He pushed Villana down and behind cover just as gunfire erupted. Bullets shredded the vegetation around them, and Silas felt one graze his arm, drawing a line of fire across his bicep. He couldn't use his bow in this dense cover, couldn't throw his knife from this distance. All he could do was keep Villana safe and hope the soldier's inexperience would work in his favor. One of the soldiers got brave and tried to flank them. Silas saw him coming, waited until the man was close, then exploded from cover. He caught the soldier in the stomach with his shoulder, driving him backward. The man's rifle went flying, and Silas grabbed it before it hit the ground. He didn't fire it. Instead, he swung it like a club, catching another soldier across the face. Bone crunched, and the man went down. Silas kept moving, using the momentum, and kicked a third soldier's legs out from under him. The fourth soldier, the one who'd first spotted them, had his weapon trained on Silas, but he was shaking, his finger on the trigger, clearly torn between duty and fear. "Don't," Silas said quietly. "You're kids. You don't have to die here." The soldier's eyes flicked to his downed companions, then back to Silas. "You're the deserter," he said, "the one who went native. I'm a survivor, and so are you if you're smart. Take your friends and go. Forget you saw us." For a long moment, the soldier didn't move. Then Villana stepped out from cover, her hands empty and open. She was unarmed, clearly not a threat, just a child. The soldier looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his face changed. He lowered his weapon. "We never saw you," he said quietly. He helped his injured friends to their feet, and they left, moving quickly, glancing back over their shoulders, like they expected Silas to change his mind and shoot them. Silas waited until they were gone before he allowed himself to breathe. His hands were shaking from the adrenaline dump, and his wounded arm was bleeding freely. Villana came to him, already pulling plants from her pack to make a poultice. "You could have killed them," she said. "Yeah. Why didn't you?" Silas thought about it. "Because they reminded me of who I used to be. Scared kids sent to fight a war they don't understand. They made camp early that night, finding a defensible position in case the soldiers changed their minds and came back with reinforcements. But the jungle remained quiet, and slowly Silas allowed himself to relax. The next morning they found evidence that the soldiers had kept their word. There were signs of passage heading away from their position, back toward human territory. No pursuit, no ambush. Just kids who'd been given a second chance and taken it. 2 days later, Silas and Villana finally made it back to their valley. Everything was as they'd left it. Their cave still hidden, their traps still set. They spent the rest of the day settling back in, falling into familiar rhythms. That night, as they sat by the fire, Villana asked the question Silas had been dreading. "What happens when I'm grown?" Silas poked at the fire with a stick, not looking at her. "What do you mean?" "I'm 10 now. In a few more years, I'll be an adult. Will I stay here? Will I go back to the village? What happens to us?" Silas didn't have an answer. He'd been avoiding thinking about the future, about what came next. But Villana deserved better than his avoidance. "I don't know," he admitted. "What do you want to happen?" Villana was quiet for a long time. "I want both," she finally said. "I want to be with my people, but I want you too. You're my family. Those things might not be compatible." "Why not? The elders accepted you. Others could too. Or," she hesitated, "or I could bring my people here. Start something new. A place where Vesuvi and humans could live together." Silas looked at her, seeing not the frightened child he'd pulled from the fire, but a young woman with dreams and plans. "That's a big idea," he said carefully. "A dangerous idea." "All good ideas are dangerous," Villana replied. "You taught me that." Silas smiled despite himself. "Did I?" "You showed me. Every time you saved someone who should have been your enemy. Every time you chose kindness over safety, you showed me that change is possible." They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire burn down. Silas thought about everything that had happened, all the choices that had led them here, and he thought about the future, uncertain and frightening, but also full of possibility. Okay, he said finally. If you want to try to build something new, I'll help you. I can't promise it'll work, but I'll help you try. Valana's face lit up with a smile that made her look like the child she still was in some ways. Thank you, she said. And in that moment, Silas knew that whatever came next, whatever challenges they faced, they would face them together. The years had carved deep lines into Silas's face and turned his hair completely white, but they had also brought an unexpected kind of peace. Word had spread through both armies about the human and the Vesuvi child, about their valley where the war didn't reach. Some called it a myth, others called it heresy, but a very few, called it hope. And slowly, carefully, that hope began to take root. The first refugee arrived 6 months after Villana's visit to the Vesuvi village. He was human, a medic named Knelt, who'd seen too much death and couldn't stomach it anymore. He stumbled into their valley half dead from exhaustion and infection, a bullet wound in his side turning septic. Silas found him collapsed near the stream. For a long moment, he stood there with his knife drawn, debating. Taking in a human was different from helping Villana. This man could betray them, could lead patrols back to their sanctuary. But Villana knelt beside Knelt and looked up at Silas with those black eyes that had seen him at his worst and best. He needs help, she said simply. Silas cursed and sheathed his knife. They carried Knelt back to the cave, and Silas used every skill he'd learned to keep the man alive. It took 3 weeks, but Knelt survived. When he was strong enough to talk, his story spilled out like poison from a wound. He'd been ordered to execute prisoners, Vesuvi civilians, including children. When he'd refused, his own commander had shot him and left him for dead. Knelt had crawled away from the execution site and just kept going, driven by nothing but the desperate need to escape. I can't go back, he said, his voice hollow. I won't. Silas understood that feeling. Then you work, he said. You hunt, you build, you contribute. No passengers here. Knelt nodded, relief flooding his face. He proved useful, his medical knowledge far exceeding Silas's crude field medicine. He set up a proper infirmary in a smaller cave, organized their supplies, taught Villana things about anatomy and healing that Silas had never known. 3 months later, 2 Vesuvi arrived. 2 sisters, Paula and Stella, who'd lost their entire family to a human napalm strike. They'd heard about the valley from Susan and Willie, heard about the place where the fire-birth man lived with one of their own. They came seeking shelter, seeking something other than endless revenge. Silas watched his quiet valley transform into something else, something he'd never imagined. The humans in Vesuvi kept their distance at first, circling each other like wary predators. But necessity bred cooperation. When Knelt fell ill with jungle fever, it was Paula who knew which plants would break it. When Stella injured her leg in a fall, it was Knelt who set the bone properly. And always at the center of it was Villana. She moved between both groups with ease, translating not just words but intentions, bridging gaps that seemed unbridgeable. She was 12 now, tall and strong, with a presence that commanded respect from both species. Silas watched her mediate a dispute between Knelt and Stella over hunting territories, watched her make them see reason when stubbornness would have led to violence. She was becoming a leader, and the realization filled him with pride and fear in equal measure. The settlement grew. By the end of the year, there were 10 of them. Humans who'd deserted, Vesuvi who'd lost everything, all seeking the same thing, a place where they could just exist without the constant shadow of war. Silas built walls around the valley entrance, not to keep anyone in, but to give warning if patrols approached. He organized watches, trained everyone in basic combat, created supply caches throughout the valley in case they needed to scatter and hide. He was preparing for the inevitable moment when their peace would be shattered. It came on a cold morning when the mist hung thick in the valley. Silas was checking his perimeter traps when he saw them. A full military platoon, 20 soldiers, moving with professional precision toward the valley entrance. He ran back, sounding the alarm. The settlement exploded into controlled chaos. Everyone knew their roles, had practiced the evacuation drill a dozen times. The humans in Vesuvi scattered into the jungle, heading for the hidden caves Silas had prepared. Silas stayed behind with Villana and Knelt. They watched from a concealed position as the soldiers entered the valley, weapons ready, expecting resistance. The platoon leader was a woman, mid-30s, with hard eyes and a scar across her jaw. She surveyed the abandoned settlement with professional interest, noting the mixed construction, the evidence of both human and Vesuvi habitation. "Sir," one of her soldiers called, "you need to see this." They'd found Reynolds' infirmary, medical supplies arranged neatly, equipment clearly meant for treating both species. The platoon leader stood there for a long moment studying it. "This isn't what command described," she said quietly. "They said it was a terrorist cell. This looks like people trying to survive," another soldier finished. The platoon leader made a decision. She pulled out her radio and made her report, but Silas, listening from his hiding spot, could hear her changing details, describing the settlement as abandoned, as not worth the resources to hunt down, recommending they mark the area as cleared and move on. Some of her soldiers looked relieved, others looked disappointed, but orders were orders. The platoon left, disappearing into the jungle the way they had come. Silas waited until nightfall before signaling the all clear. The settlers returned slowly, checking for traps or ambushes. When everyone was accounted for, they gathered in the central clearing. "They'll come back," Stella said, "or send others." "Maybe," Silas agreed, "but not today. We bought some time." "How much time?" Reynolds asked. Silas looked at Villana, saw her standing tall despite her fear. "Enough," he said, "enough to matter." That night, as the settlement settled back into uneasy normalcy, Villana came to sit beside Silas at his usual watching post. "You're thinking about leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. Silas didn't deny it. "Drawing them here puts everyone at risk. You're the reason everyone is here. You're the reason this place exists." Villana looked at him with those ancient eyes. "You don't get to leave just because it's getting dangerous. That's when we need you most." Silas wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. He'd started this, however, accidentally. These people had come here because of the story of the man who'd chosen a child over a war. He couldn't abandon that now. "Okay," he said finally. "I stay." Viana leaned against his shoulder, the way she had when she was small. "Good, because I wasn't going to let you leave anyway." Silas smiled despite everything. "I know." They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere in the darkness, patrols moved and armies clashed, and the war ground on. But here, in this small valley, there was peace. Fragile, temporary, but real. And Silas realized that this was what he'd been fighting for all along, even when he didn't know it. Not victory, not even survival, but the simple possibility of something better. A place where an old human and a young Vesuvi could sit together under alien stars and call each other family. Below them, lights flickered in the settlement as humans and Vesuvi prepared for tomorrow. Together they would hunt, build, defend this small pocket of sanity in a world gone mad. And maybe, just maybe, they would show both sides that there was another way. Silas knew the odds were against them, knew that eventually the war would find them, that their peace couldn't last. But for now, watching over this impossible family he'd somehow acquired, he allowed himself to hope. And hope, he'd learned, was the most dangerous weapon of all.